In 755 AD, a general named Lushan launched a rebellion against the Tang Dynasty. He controlled three of China's most powerful frontier armies, approximately 160,000 soldiers. He had been personally promoted by the emperor. He had been adopted as a son by the emperor's favorite concubine. He had dined at the imperial table hundreds of times. When his forces sacked Luoyang and then Chang'an, the largest city in the world, a metropolis of nearly 2 million people, the emperor fled in the middle of the night, abandoning the capital without warning its population. Archaeologists excavating sites near the old Tang capital at Xi'an since the 1990s have uncovered mass burial pits containing skeletal remains of civilians killed during the sack, bones showing evidence of execution-style killing, consistent with the historical accounts of what happened when the city fell. The death toll from the Lushan rebellion across its 8 years is estimated by modern historians at between 13 and 36 million people, roughly 1/5 of the entire world population at the time, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The Tang Dynasty survived the rebellion, but it never recovered. The government that limped on for another 150 years was a shadow of what had existed before. Its territory contracted, its finances broken, its military dependent on the same kind of regional warlords whose ambitions had started the catastrophe. So here is the question: how does the most cosmopolitan, most culturally brilliant civilization on Earth, in the 8th century, trust a military commander so completely that his betrayal nearly ends civilization as they knew it? The Tang Dynasty was born from wreckage. The dynasty that preceded it, the Sui, had unified China after nearly 4 centuries of division, built the Grand Canal connecting the Yellow River to the Yangtze, and launched 3 catastrophic invasions of Korea that collectively killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers and exhausted the treasury, the agricultural labor force, and the political legitimacy of its founding family in less than 40 years. The Sui Emperor Yang Yangdi is one of the most productive and most destructive rulers in Chinese history, a man whose genuine engineering achievements and whose fiscal and military recklessness exist in the same reign without apparent contradiction. The Grand Canal that he expanded and connected is still functioning today, still carrying goods between northern and southern China along a route that Sui engineers established 14 centuries ago. The campaigns in Korea that he launched 3 times between 612 and 614 CE, each time committing armies of over 1 million soldiers to operations whose logistical requirements were beyond the administrative capacity of the state to sustain, killed approximately 300,000 men in the first campaign alone, and that was the campaign that reached Korea. The supply columns that had been sent ahead were massacred by Korean forces. The bodies were so numerous that Korean soldiers built victory towers from the skulls. The rebellions that ended the Sui dynasty were not a single organized uprising, but a cascade of regional revolts, each starting from a specific local grievance: excessive taxation, forced labor corvée for the canal construction, conscription for the Korean campaigns, and spreading as successful rebels demonstrated that the Sui government's coercive capacity was failing. By 617 CE, the dynasty controlled only fractions of the territory it had unified 20 years earlier, and the question was not whether it would fall, but which of the competing rebel leaders would be in a position to reunify China afterward. Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, a Sui provincial governor who had maintained loyalty to the dynasty longer than most, moved in 617 CE, capturing the Sui capital of Chang'an with the assistance of his son Li Shimin, and with a military strategy whose speed and political intelligence distinguished it from the more straightforwardly military operations of his rivals. Within 3 years, Li Yuan's forces had defeated or absorbed the other major rebel factions, and in 618 CE he proclaimed the Tang Dynasty, taking the imperial title as Emperor Gaozu. What distinguished the Tang founding from the Sui founding it replaced, and from the Han founding 4 centuries earlier, was the specific combination of military competence, political pragmatism, and administrative continuity that Li Yuan and his successors maintained. Tang founder did not attempt to rebuild the bureaucratic apparatus from scratch. He retained Sui administrative structures, Sui administrative personnel, and the Sui tax and land registers that provided the informational foundation for functioning governance. The transition from Sui to Tang was, in administrative terms, a replacement of the royal family at the top of a continuing institutional structure rather than the reconstruction of government from ruins. Li Shimin, who became Emperor Taizong in 626 CE after deposing his father and killing his brothers in the Xuanwu Gate incident, is, by the consensus of Chinese historical tradition, the greatest emperor in Chinese history. The specific nature of his greatness and the specific circumstances that produced it are worth examining carefully rather than simply asserting. The Xuanwu Gate incident is the event that Chinese official history has always found difficult to celebrate and impossible to ignore. In June 626 CE, Li Shimin arranged the assassination of his brothers, Crown Prince Li Jiansheng and Prince Li Yuanji, at the gates of the imperial palace, then presented his father Emperor Gaozu with the accomplished fact that his only surviving son was now the obvious heir. Gaozu abdicated 3 months later. The official Confucian historiographical tradition, which values filial piety and fraternal loyalty as foundational virtues, has spent 14 centuries negotiating with the reality that the dynasty's defining emperor came to power through fratricide and forced abdication. What Taizong did with the power he had acquired by these means was genuine and remarkable. His reign from 626 to 649 CE, the Zhengguan era, whose name translates roughly as correct contemplation, established institutional precedents whose influence on Chinese governance lasted centuries. He was personally accessible to remonstrance from officials to a degree that Chinese court culture rarely produced, explicitly inviting criticism of his decisions and demonstrating, on multiple documented occasions, the willingness to reverse course when persuasive objections were raised. His relationship with his chief advisor Wei Zheng, who criticized the emperor's decisions to his face repeatedly, including in public court settings, is the most celebrated example in Chinese historical tradition of the ideal relationship between a wise ruler and a fearless minister. The specific institutional development of Taizong's reign that had the most lasting consequences was the consolidation and expansion of the civil service examination system. Tang examinations, particularly the Jinshi degree, which tested literary composition and classical scholarship, became the primary pathway to senior government appointments, and the culture of intense educational investment that the examination system created became one of the defining characteristics of Chinese elite culture for the next 13 centuries. The examinations were not perfectly meritocratic. Family connections, access to expensive tutors, and the social capital of established networks all provided advantages. But they established and maintained the principle that demonstrated intellectual competence was necessary for government appointment. The genetic and ethnic composition of the Tang imperial family is one of the most interesting and most politically sensitive questions in Tang historical scholarship. The Li family had intermarried extensively with Xianbei, a Turkic-speaking nomadic people from the northeastern steppe who had established multiple northern Chinese dynasties during the centuries of division that preceded the Sui, and the specific genetic and cultural contributions of this mixed ancestry to the Tang dynasty's specific qualities has been debated. Modern genetic analysis of remains identified as members of the Tang imperial family, combined with the historical documentation of the family's genealogy, confirms significant non-Han ancestry in the dynasty's founding generation. Chang'an, the Tang capital, located in the Wei River Valley of modern Shaanxi province on the site of the earlier Han capital, was, by the 8th century CE, the largest city in the world. Archaeological surveys of the city's perimeter walls, conducted by Chinese archaeologists since the 1950s, and significantly expanded through remote sensing analysis since the 1990s, establish a walled area of approximately 84 square kilometers, roughly 12 times the area of contemporary Constantinople and significantly larger than Abbasid Baghdad. Population estimates for Chang'an range from 800,000 to nearly 2 million people within the city and its immediate suburbs. The city was organized on a grid plan of extraordinary regularity, 108 rectangular wards divided by roads running precisely north-south and east-west, each ward enclosed by its own walls and gates that were closed at night on the signal of a drum. This grid organization was not simply aesthetic, it was an administrative tool. Each ward was a distinct unit of governance, with registered households, appointed ward heads responsible for tax collection and order maintenance, and regular inspections by city officials whose records survive in portions sufficient for historians to reconstruct the administrative functioning of the city in considerable detail. The Silk Road, the network of overland and maritime trade routes that connected Chang'an to Central Asia, Persia, the Byzantine Empire, and eventually the Mediterranean, reached its peak activity during the Tang period, and the cosmopolitan character of Chang'an was its most direct expression. The northwestern markets of the city, near the western gates through which the Silk Road caravans entered, were home to communities of Sogdian, Persian, Arab, and Central Asian merchants whose presence is documented not just in the written sources, but in the physical evidence of Tang Dynasty tombs. The three-color glazed pottery figures of Tang ceramic art include figures of foreign merchants, Central Asian musicians, and Bactrian camels that provide a visual record of the foreign presence in the city at the peak of the Silk Road's activity. The Grand Canal that the Sui dynasty had constructed, connecting the Yangtze River Valley to the Yellow River and ultimately to the capital, was the economic artery that made it possible to feed and supply Chang'an's enormous population. Without the canal, the surplus grain of the south could not have been transported to the capital in the quantities required to sustain a city of this scale. The maintenance of the canal, its embankments, its locks, its dredging schedule, was one of the continuous administrative priorities of the Tang state, and the records of canal management that survive from the period are among the most detailed administrative documents of Tang governance. The Yellow River that flows through the northern agricultural heartland and the Yangtze that drains the economically expanding south were connected by this canal in a commercial and administrative integration whose maintenance was essential to Tang prosperity. The specific vulnerability this created, dependence on the canal for the capital's food supply, would prove critical during the Lushan rebellion, when rebel control of sections of the canal cut off supply to the forces attempting to recover the capital. The territorial expansion of the Tang Empire under Emperor Taizong and his successors represents the greatest geographic extent of Chinese imperial authority in the pre-modern period, a dominance whose reach into Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam was achieved through a combination of military campaigns, diplomatic marriages, and the creation of a tributary system that connected the Tang court to polities across an enormous geographic range. The defeat of the Eastern Turkic Khaganate in 630 CE was the foundational military achievement of Taizong's reign and the event that established Tang dominance over the Central Asian steppe routes on which the Silk Road depended. The Eastern Turks had been the dominant power north of China for decades, extracting tribute from the Sui dynasty and from the competing Chinese factions during the Civil War period. Taizong's military campaign, exploiting a division within the Turkic leadership and striking at a moment of Turkic weakness, destroyed the Khaganate's political coherence and extended Tang military reach to the Mongolian plateau. The Turkic Khagan was brought as a captive to Chang'an, where he performed obeisance before the Tang emperor, in a ceremony whose political symbolism was enormous. The nomadic power that had dominated the steppe for a century, acknowledging Chinese supremacy. The court's approach to the incorporated Turkic military personnel was pragmatic and consequential. Rather than dispersing or eliminating the defeated Turkic forces, Taizong absorbed them into the Tang military establishment as frontier garrison troops under their own commanders, an arrangement that provided experienced cavalry for the empire's northern defense while creating the precedent of non-Chinese commanders controlling significant portions of the frontier military. This arrangement worked well under capable emperors who maintained the personal relationships required to keep frontier commanders loyal. Under weaker emperors, it created exactly the structural vulnerability that Lushan would exploit a century later. The Korean campaigns that Tang Taizong launched against the kingdom of Goguryeo, repeating with better managed logistics, the catastrophic Sui attempts, achieved partial success in his reign and complete success under his successor Gaozong, who, in alliance with the kingdom of Silla, conquered both Goguryeo and Baekje in 668 CE, bringing the entire Korean peninsula under nominal Tang suzerainty for the first time. The alliance with Silla proved more durable than Tang political control. Silla eventually expelled Tang forces from the peninsula by 676 CE and unified Korea under its own authority, but maintained a tributary relationship with Tang China that shaped Korean cultural development for centuries. The Tang civil service examination system that Taizong refined and his successors expanded created, over the dynasty's 3 centuries, an educated elite who shared literary culture, the ability to compose regulated verse and classical prose in specific styles, was the primary bond of the Chinese imperial administrative class. The specific examination genre of regulated verse, Lushi, the 8-line poem with strict tonal patterns and parallel construction requirements, was developed specifically as an examination form and became, simultaneously, one of the most demanding and most productive literary constraints in world poetry. The Tang poets whose work in this form defines the peak of classical Chinese poetry, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, Bai Ju Yi, were not writing in an academic exercise form. They were writing in the form that their entire culture valued as the highest expression of literary intelligence. The Tang military was, at its peak in the 7th century, the most effective military organization in Asia, a combined arms force whose specific capabilities in cavalry operations, siege warfare, and strategic mobility were unmatched by any contemporary power, and whose campaigns extended Chinese military reach from Korea to Central Asia, Vietnam. The Fubing system, the militia-based military organization of the early Tang, provided the institutional foundation for this military effectiveness. Under the Fubing system, military service was tied to land allocation. Soldiers received land grants from the state in exchange for equipping themselves at their own expense and reporting for service when mobilized. The system was efficient from a fiscal standpoint. It minimized standing military costs by distributing them among the farming population, and it produced soldiers with genuine personal investment in the land they defended. The Fubing soldiers who formed the early Tang military's core were not professional warriors in the sense that the later Mamluk soldiers were, but their combination of adequate training, reasonable equipment, and genuine motivation made them effective against the less organized opponents the early Tang faced. The cavalry that Tang armies deployed in their Central Asian campaigns was built on the specific horse breeds introduced from the steppes. The Fergana horses that the Han Dynasty had first acquired, supplemented by the Turkic cavalry personnel and their horses that Taizong had, incorporated after the Eastern Turkic conquest. The combination of Chinese military organization with steppe cavalry expertise was what made Tang Central Asian operations possible. Neither element alone would have been sufficient. The siege warfare capabilities of the Tang military were demonstrated most clearly in the Korean campaigns, where the fortress cities of Goguryeo required sustained siege operations of a complexity that earlier Chinese military technology had been inadequate to conduct successfully. The specific engineering techniques deployed, earthwork construction, the use of catapults and battering rams, the systematic destruction of defensive water supplies, were developed through the accumulated experience of the Sui campaigns and refined through the early Tang operations. The fubing system began to break down in the late 7th and early 8th centuries as land concentration, the same process that had undermined the Han's land grant systems centuries earlier, made it impossible to provide sufficient land to fubing soldier families to sustain their military equipment obligations. The military response to this breakdown was the creation of professional standing armies on the frontiers, the Jidushi system, in which frontier regions were placed under the authority of military governors who commanded permanent professional forces funded by the regional tax revenues. This institutional shift was fiscally necessary and strategically dangerous. Professional frontier armies were more consistently effective than fubing militia. They were also more completely under the personal authority of their commanders rather than the imperial court's institutional control. And Lushan, who held the Jidushi command of 3 northeastern frontier regions simultaneously, an accumulation of regional military authority that the central government permitted because his military effectiveness against the Khitan and Shi tribes on the northern border was genuinely valuable, commanded a professional force that was, in training, equipment, and operational experience, probably the best military force in China by the mid-8th century. When he turned it against the dynasty, it was also the most dangerous. Zetian, who ruled China from 690 to 705 CE as the only woman in Chinese history to hold the imperial title as sovereign emperor, is one of the most studied, most debated, and most politically charged figures in the entire Chinese historical tradition. Understanding her career requires separating what the historical sources actually record from the specific distortions that the Confucian historical tradition imposed on her memory. She entered the Tang court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, an arrangement that should have ended with his death in 649 CE. Court practice required former concubines to shave their heads and retire to Buddhist nunneries when their patron emperor died. Wu circumvented this through her relationship with Taizong's successor, his son Emperor Gaozong, who brought her back from the nunnery and elevated her to the position of Empress Consort in 655 CE, displacing the previous empress, through a political maneuver whose specific details, including the accusation that Wu had killed her own infant daughter to frame the previous empress, are documented in sources written by people who despised her and therefore require careful evaluation. What is documentable is that Wu exercised increasing political authority during Gaozong's reign as his health deteriorated. He suffered from what historical sources describe as severe headaches and vision problems that modern medical historians have interpreted as possibly neurological, and served as effective regent during the periods when he was incapacitated. After his death in 683 CE, she ruled through her sons as Empress Dowager before declaring a new dynasty, the Zhou, in 690 CE and taking the imperial title herself. The specific achievements of her reign are significant and often under-acknowledged in the popular emphasis on her ruthlessness. She expanded the examination system, opening it more genuinely to candidates from outside the established aristocratic families. She reformed the military command structure in ways that reduced aristocratic dominance of senior positions. She managed the complicated politics of the Tang-Tibetan frontier through a combination of military and diplomatic means that produced a reasonable level of stability. And she sponsored Buddhist art and architecture on a scale that produced some of the most magnificent Buddhist monuments of the Tang period. The Lushan, who would eventually destroy the dynasty, was at the peak of his power under Emperor Xuanzang. Minghuang, the brilliant emperor, whose reign from 712 to 756 CE encompasses both the Tang Dynasty's cultural peak and its catastrophic unraveling. Xuanzang, in his early reign, was a capable and energetic ruler who reformed the administrative system, promoted talented officials including the statesman Zhang Jiuling, and presided over a court whose cultural patronage made Chang'an the center of the 8th century world's literary and artistic production. Li Bai and Du Fu, the two poets whose work defines the peak of classical Chinese literature, both live in his reign. The poet Wang Wei, the painter Wu Daozi, the court culture of Xuanzang's peak years was as brilliantly productive as any in Chinese history. The transformation of Xuanzang from capable ruler to distracted emperor is attributed in the sources, and in the popular tradition of the Chang'an, the Song of Everlasting Regret by Bai Juyi, written 50 years after the events, to his relationship with Yang Guifei, the concubine whose beauty and intelligence captivated him, and whose family connections, particularly her cousin Yang Guozhong, who became chief minister, distorted the court's decision-making in the years before the rebellion. Whether Yang Guifei's influence on the emperor was truly the cause of the Lushan catastrophe, or whether the sources are using a familiar narrative of female temptation to avoid more uncomfortable institutional explanations, is one of the live questions of Tang historiography. Chang'an at the Tang Dynasty's peak was not simply a large city. It was a particular kind of urban environment, cosmopolitan in a way that no Chinese city before or after it, until the modern period, quite replicated, whose specific social texture reflected the Silk Road trade networks that converged on it and the deliberately inclusive cultural policy of a dynasty that had itself been shaped by the mixing of Chinese and steppe cultures. The western markets of Chang'an, the two main commercial districts of the city, known simply as the Eastern and Western markets, were the commercial centers of the empire and the point of entry for the Silk Road's goods and peoples. The Western market in particular, positioned near the gates through which caravans arrived from Central Asia, was surrounded by the communities of foreign merchants who had established permanent residences in the city. Sogdians from the Samarkand region who dominated the long-distance trade, Persians whose presence in China predated the Tang by centuries, Arabs whose commercial networks were expanding rapidly alongside the spread of Islam, and smaller communities from India, Southeast Asia, and beyond. The evidence for this cosmopolitan presence is not just documentary. Tang dynasty tombs from across the empire contain ceramic figures. The famous Tang Sankai, or three-color glazed pottery, that depict foreigners with a specificity of facial features, dress, and accessories that suggests observation rather than generalization. A Sogdian merchant figure in Tang ceramic art has a hooked nose, a beard, and a peaked cap of a specific Central Asian style. A Malay or Southeast Asian figure has distinct features and dress appropriate to a tropical climate. The artisans who made these tomb figures were depicting the actual diversity of people they saw in Tang China's cities, and the distribution of these foreign figure ceramics across tomb sites from Chang'an to Luoyang to the provincial cities demonstrates that the foreign presence in Tang China extended well beyond the capital. The food culture of Tang China was, by the evidence of the surviving agricultural and culinary texts, already highly sophisticated and already showing the specific regional variation between north and south that remains characteristic of Chinese cuisine today. Northern Chinese cuisine in the Tang period was based primarily on wheat and millet, the staples of the Yellow River agricultural system, prepared as noodles, steamed buns, and flatbreads of various kinds. Southern Chinese cuisine was rice-based. Both northern and southern cuisines incorporated the spices and aromatics that arrived via the Silk Road: pepper, cardamom, cloves, and various aromatics from South and Southeast Asia, in ways that changed the flavor profiles of Chinese cooking permanently. The status of women in Tang society was, relative to the subsequent Song dynasty that followed, notably freer. Wu Zetian's reign, whatever one thinks of her specific methods, established that female political authority was not simply inconceivable within the Chinese imperial framework. Tang women of the elite classes participated in outdoor activities, polo, riding, hunting, that the more restrictive Confucian norms of later dynasties would prohibit. The specific ceramic evidence for Tang women's lives: tomb figures showing women in riding clothes, playing polo, Participating in court entertainments depicts a social environment significantly more mobile and visible for women than the literary sources alone would suggest. The physical remains of Chang'an lie beneath and around the modern city of Xi'an in Shaanxi province, and the progressive revelation of those remains through archaeological investigation over the past 70 years has produced an increasingly detailed picture of what was, in the 8th century CE, the largest and most sophisticated city in the world. The city walls, their foundations still traceable under the modern city, with some sections preserved as archaeological parks, define a rectangular enclosure approximately 9.7 kilometers east-west and 8.6 kilometers north-south, for a total area of approximately 84 square kilometers. Within this enclosure, the grid of 108 wards was organized around two main north-south and east-west axes, with the imperial palace complex occupying the northern central position from which the city's symmetrical layout extended southward. The precision of the grid, visible in the modern street pattern that still partially follows Tang-era street alignments, required sophisticated surveying and construction engineering whose specific methods are documented in surviving technical manuals of the period. The imperial palace complexes, the Taiji Palace at the northern end of the main axis and the Daming Palace to its northeast, built by Taizong and expanded by subsequent emperors, have been extensively excavated since the 1950s, with major archaeological campaigns in the 1980s and 2000s, and an ongoing excavation and conservation program managed by the Chang'an Research Institute. The Daming Palace complex, covering approximately 3.2 square kilometers and containing hundreds of individual structures, is one of the largest palace complexes ever built in the world. The excavations have revealed detailed information about construction techniques, the layout of ceremonial and residential spaces, and the material culture of imperial court life, ceramics, metalwork, glass, and the architectural remains of the buildings themselves. The underground drainage system of Chang'an has been a particularly productive area of archaeological investigation because the ceramic drain pipes and stone-lined channels that constitute it are well preserved and distributed across the entire city area. The system that emerges from this investigation was sophisticated and comprehensive, a network of drains running beneath every ward of the city, collecting both rainwater and household waste, and channeling it to outlets in the city walls that discharged into the moat system. The specific engineering of this drainage system, the calculated gradients, the pipe connections, the junction chambers, represents a level of urban infrastructure planning comparable to the best Roman engineering of a comparable period. The two commercial markets of Chang'an, each occupying approximately one city ward and surrounded by the commercial establishments of the traders who used them, are documented in the surviving Tang administrative texts with unusual specificity. The markets were organized into guilds by trade, with specific areas designated for specific commodities. Opening and closing times were regulated, weights and measures were standardized and enforced by market officials. The documents recording market regulations, tax rates, and the administration of commercial disputes provide a window into the commercial functioning of a Tang city that complements the more general picture available from other sources. The religious life of Tang China was more genuinely diverse than that of any Chinese dynasty before or after it, a function of the Silk Road's role as a conduit for religious ideas as well as commercial goods, and of the Tang Dynasty's specific cultural cosmopolitanism that created space for religious traditions outside the mainstream Chinese framework. Buddhism was the dominant organized religion of Tang China, and the dynasty's relationship with Buddhism was complex and consequential. Emperor Taizong patronized Buddhist translation projects, most famously by sponsoring the monk Xuanzang, the historical figure behind the later novel Journey to the West, who had traveled to India to collect Buddhist scriptures and returned with hundreds of texts that he spent the rest of his life translating at Chang'an's Zetian temple. The wild goose pagoda that was built to house these translations still stands in Xi'an today, one of the best preserved Tang buildings above ground. The specific relationship between Tang rulers and Buddhism went through multiple phases, from patronage to suppression and back to accommodation. Emperor Wu Zetian claimed Buddhist endorsement for her imperial authority, commissioning Buddhist texts that identified her with the Maitreya, the future Buddha, and using Buddhist institutional support to legitimize her unprecedented female rule. The Buddhist establishment's political utility to her was matched by her material generosity to it. The construction programs she sponsored produced some of the most impressive Buddhist art of the Tang period. The suppression of Buddhism under Emperor Wuzong in 842 to 845 CE, the Huichang suppression, named for the Huichang reign period, was the most severe anti-Buddhist campaign in Chinese history, destroying approximately 600 monasteries and 40,000 temples, forcing approximately 260,000 monks and nuns to return to lay life, and confiscating the substantial landholdings and metal objects that the Buddhist institution had accumulated. The motivations were partly fiscal. The monastery lands and metal objects represented enormous wealth that a state increasingly desperate for revenue wanted to recover, and partly ideological, with Wuzong's Taoist advisors providing the intellectual framework for viewing Buddhist wealth and institutional power as threats to the state. The other religious traditions that the Silk Road brought to Tang China, Zoroastrianism from Persia, Nestorian Christianity from the Levant, Manichaeanism from Central Asia, Islam from the Arabian Peninsula, each established communities and institutions in Tang cities during the dynasty's peak period. The Nestorian stele, discovered in Xi'an in 1625 and now housed in the Forest of Stone Steel's museum, is a 781 CE monument in Chinese and Syriac, recording the history of Nestorian Christianity in China from its first arrival in 635 CE, a document whose existence testifies to the genuine presence of Christian communities in Tang China at a period when Christianity was also spreading westward into Europe. The stele's specific content, describing Christian theology in Buddhist and Taoist vocabulary, a deliberate translation strategy whose aim was to make Christianity comprehensible to Chinese audiences, is a remarkable example of the cross-cultural religious synthesis that Tang China's cosmopolitan environment made possible. The Tang Dynasty's technological achievements built on the Han Dynasty's foundation while developing specifically new capabilities in printing, astronomy, mechanical engineering, and the applied sciences that served the empire's commercial and military needs. Woodblock printing, the technique of carving a text or image in reverse into a wood block, inking the block, and pressing paper against it to produce a printed copy, was developed into a practical publishing technology during the Tang period. The earliest dated printed book in existence is the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE and discovered in the Dunhuang Caves in 1900 by the British archaeologist R.L. Stein. The Dunhuang Caves, a complex of Buddhist cave temples on the Silk Road in Gansu province, had been sealed for approximately 900 years, preserving approximately 40,000 manuscripts and printed documents in multiple languages that constitute the most significant documentary find from ancient China outside of deliberate archival preservation. The Diamond Sutra itself, a woodblock printed scroll nearly 5.5 meters long, demonstrates printing technology of considerable sophistication. The carved text is clear, and even the ink distribution is consistent, and the colophon at the end of the document, reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his two parents on the 15th of the 4th moon of the 9th year of Xantong, documents both the specific date of printing and the specifically Buddhist motivation of producing merit through distributing a sacred text. The combination of advanced printing technology, specific documentary evidence, and the Buddhist motivational context tells a complete story about how Tang culture and Tang technology interacted. The astronomical clock, designed by Yi Xing and Liang Lingzan in 725 CE, was the most sophisticated mechanical device in the world at the time of its construction. A water-powered astronomical instrument that tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, indicated the time of day, and demonstrated the daily rotation of the celestial sphere in a mechanical model that rotated in synchrony with the actual sky. The device combined gear mechanisms, escapement technology, and hydraulic power in ways that would not be replicated in Europe for another 5 centuries. The specific engineering details that survive in the Tang astronomical records have been studied by historians of technology who find the device's combination of mechanisms genuinely impressive. The Tang military's use of gunpowder-based incendiary weapons, the fire arrows, fire bombs, and various combustion devices documented in the military texts of the period, represents the earliest military application of the gunpowder technology that Chinese alchemists had discovered during the search for immortality elixirs. The Tang military texts of the 9th century describe devices that are recognizably gunpowder-based, using a formula, charcoal, saltpeter, sulfur, whose proportions were still being refined. The full development of gunpowder weapons into the rockets, firearms, and artillery, whose descendants would eventually transform world warfare, was a Song and later dynasty achievement, but the Tang period was where the military applications of the chemistry first appeared in documented form. And Lushan was, before his rebellion, one of the most celebrated commanders in the Tang military establishment, and the specific process by which the Tang court elevated him to the position from which he was able to launch the most destructive rebellion in Chinese history is a case study in how political systems fail to maintain the checks that their own vulnerability requires. Born around 703 CE of mixed Sogdian Turkic ancestry, and Lushan had grown up on the northeastern frontier and had made his career through the frontier military system, first as an informal military leader in border skirmishes, then as a commander under the Ji-Dushi system. He was physically striking. Contemporary sources emphasize his enormous size and weight, which was apparently unusual enough in the Tang context to be repeatedly remarked upon, and personally charming in the specific way that successful military leaders of his era needed to be: generous to his subordinates, entertaining to his superiors, and effective in the operations that the court valued. His relationship with Emperor Xuanzang and Yang Guifei, the emperor's favorite concubine, was an exercise in court performance that the sources describe with a mixture of amusement and hindsight dread. Yang Guifei performed a mock adoption ceremony, making An Lushan her symbolic son, despite the fact that he was older than she was. And Lushan performed infantile antics at court, reportedly allowing the emperor and Yang Guifei to dress him as a baby at a court entertainment, rolling around on the floor to the amusement of the assembled courtiers. Whether these performances were calculated political theatre, demonstrating that he was too childlike and ridiculous to be a threat, or genuine expressions of the court culture of the period, is a question whose answer matters for the historical interpretation. What is clear is that the court's assessment of An Lushan as a loyal and manageable commander was catastrophically wrong. His accumulation of 3 simultaneous Ji-Dushi commands, the Fanyang, Pinglu, and Hedong military governorships, controlling an estimated 160 Zheozone frontier troops, was the specific institutional vulnerability that his rebellion exploited. The Tang court had permitted this accumulation because his frontier effectiveness was genuinely valuable. The court's chief minister, Yang Guozhong, Yang Guifei's cousin, whose appointment was itself a product of the court favoritism that distorted decision-making in Xuanzang's later reign, recognized An Lushan's danger and lobbied for his removal. An Lushan, recognizing that Yang Guozhong's opposition would eventually produce his recall or worse, launched his rebellion in December 755 CE before the court could act. The Tibetan Empire, the other major external threat of the Tang period, had been pressing the empire's western frontier since the 7th century, and the military resources required for the Tibetan front were one of the factors that made the Jiaduxi frontier military system seem necessary rather than dangerous. The Battle of the Talas River in 751 CE, in which a Tang army under the Korean-born commander Gao Xianji was defeated by an Abbasid Arab force, ending Tang military reach in Central Asia, is famous partly because Arab chronicles report that Chinese papermakers captured during the battle were brought to Samarkand and taught Arab craftsmen the technology of papermaking, which then spread westward to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. The Tang Dynasty's peak, the reign of Emperor Xuanzang from 712 to approximately 740 CE, before the court's late reign deterioration, was, by the convergence of multiple metrics, one of the most extraordinary periods in the history of human civilization. Chang'an in 742 CE, according to the household census of that year, contained approximately 362,000 households within the walled city and its immediate suburbs, implying a total population of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, depending on the household size estimates applied. This was the largest city in the world by a considerable margin. Contemporary Constantinople had a population of perhaps 400,000. Abbasid Baghdad, founded in 762 CE, was explicitly designed to rival Tang Chang'an and eventually reach comparable size in the 9th century. The empire's total population in 742 CE registered at approximately 52.9 million households, implying a total population of roughly 52 to 60 million people, was the largest in the world and represented approximately 1/5 of the global total. The agricultural surplus generated by this population, organized through the land tenure system and taxed by the empire's fiscal administration, provided the revenue for the military establishment, the court, the construction programs, and the administrative apparatus. The Silk Road at its Tang period peak was moving goods whose value, extrapolated from the documentary evidence and from the archaeological finds at Silk Road sites, was greater than at any previous point in history. The specific commodities moving eastward, Sasanian silver vessels, Byzantine glassware, Central Asian metalwork, Indian textiles, Southeast Asian aromatics, and westward, Chinese silk, ceramics, and bronze, are documented not just in the written sources, but in the physical evidence of the finds at key sites. The Shosoin treasure house at Nara in Japan, deposited in the 8th century, contains Tang-era objects of Chinese, Central Asian, and Persian manufacture that provide a material record of the Silk Road's actual commercial output. The literary and artistic production of the Tang peak period represents, by the judgment of every subsequent generation of Chinese cultural critics, the highest achievement in the classical literary tradition. The roughly 50,000 Tang poems that survive, compiled in the Quantangxi, the complete Tang poems, in the 18th century, are the largest body of classical Chinese poetry from any dynasty and include the work of approximately 200 individual poets. The concentration of genius in the mid-8th century, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, is remarkable enough that historians of literature treat it as requiring explanation rather than simply celebration. The specific conditions of Tang court culture, the examination system that made literary achievement a pathway to status, the patronage networks that rewarded poetic excellence, and the Silk Road cosmopolitanism that brought diverse cultural influences into contact, created the conditions for a literary flowering whose products remain foundational to Chinese literary identity. The Lushan rebellion that began in December 755 CE lasted 8 years, killed somewhere between 13 and 36 million people. The range reflects genuine scholarly uncertainty about the demographic evidence and transformed the Tang dynasty from the dominant power in Asia to a fragile state dependent on the regional military governors whose power rebellion had made permanent. When Lushan's forces moved south from their northeastern base, the Tang court's military response was chaotic. The standing armies that had made the Tang military formidable in the early dynasty had been progressively replaced by the Jidushi frontier forces, whose loyalty ran to their commanders rather than to the imperial institution. The interior of China, where the capital and the main population centers were located, had been demilitarized for decades as the frontier garrisons absorbed the military budget. When Lushan's 160,000-man army moved toward Luoyang and Chang'an, there was essentially no organized military force between them and the cities. Emperor Xuanzang fled Chang'an in July 756 CE with his court and imperial family, an act that the dynasty's supporters subsequently rationalized as a strategic withdrawal, but that contemporary observers, including the poet Du Fu, experienced as abandonment. The soldiers who accompanied the emperor's flight mutinied at the Maowei postal station, approximately 60 kilometers from Chang'an, killing Yang Guozhong, whom they blamed for the military disasters through his mismanagement of the court's response, and demanding the execution of Yang Guifei. Xuanzang, reportedly weeping, ordered his concubine strangled. She was 40 years old. This incident, the Maowei incident, became the subject of Bai Juyi's Song of Everlasting Regret, the most celebrated narrative poem in the Chinese classical tradition, written 50 years later as a meditation on the relationship between personal love and political catastrophe. And Lushan was murdered by his own son in 757 CE, part of the internal conflicts that eventually fractured the rebellion's leadership and allowed Tang forces, supplemented by Uyghur cavalry brought in as allied mercenaries at enormous political cost, to recover the two capitals. But the recovery did not restore the pre-rebellion order. The military governors who had organized the resistance to Lushan were not subsequently disarmed or reintegrated into the imperial system. They became permanent regional powers, Jidushi, whose territories were effectively autonomous states, whose military forces were loyal to themselves rather than to the Tang court, and whose tax revenues flowed primarily to their own establishments rather than to the imperial treasury. The court eunuchs, whose political influence had been growing since the mid-Tang period as a function of their control of palace access and their availability for sensitive missions that official bureaucrats could not undertake, became increasingly powerful in the post-rebellion decades as successive emperors sought reliable loyalists in an environment where the civil and military establishment had proven catastrophically unreliable. The eunuchs' control of the palace armies in the capital, the Shent's military force, gave them the ability to depose and install emperors, an ability they exercised repeatedly in the late Tang period. The Tang Dynasty's final century, from the suppression of the Lushan rebellion in 76, 3 CE to the dynasty's formal end in 907 CE, was a long, slow diminishment whose specific episodes of crisis were separated by periods of apparent stability that the court's optimists interpreted as recoveries, and that historians, with hindsight, recognize as pauses in a progressive decline. The Huangchao rebellion of E74 to 884 CE was the event that destroyed what remained of the Tang's institutional capacity. Huang Chao was a salt merchant who had repeatedly failed the Jinshi examination, the examination system's most prestigious degree, and whose personal frustration with the imperial system combined with genuine popular grievances about the economic conditions of the late Tang to produce a rebellion of extraordinary geographic scope. His forces swept across China from north to south and back again, capturing Chang'an in 880 CE and holding it for 3 years. The sack of Chang'an by Huang Chao's forces was described by the contemporary scholar, official Wei Zhuang, in a poem, the Qin Fu Yin, or Lament for the Qin Women. That is one of the most vivid descriptions of urban destruction in classical Chinese literature. Wei Zhuang describes streets full of corpses, palaces looted and burned, the disappearance of the cosmopolitan urban culture that had defined Chang'an for centuries. The city that had been the center of the world in the 8th century was effectively destroyed, not physically leveled, but stripped of the population density, commercial activity, and cultural institutions that had made it the world's greatest city. The warlord who eventually drove Huangchao out of Chang'an, Zhu Wen, a former subordinate commander of Huangchao, who had defected to the Tang side, emerged from the final years of the Tang as the dominant military power in northern China. He controlled the court, managed the succession of child emperors with the same puppet master technique that Cao Cao had used 700 years earlier, and in 907 CE accepted the abdication of the last Tang emperor and declared a new dynasty, the later Liang. The last Tang emperor, Ai, who was 14 years old when he abdicated, was murdered by Zhu Wen the following year. The dynasty that had defined Chinese civilization for 3 centuries ended with a child emperor's forced abdication and subsequent assassination by the man who had forced it. The Tang dynasty's legacy is distributed across the physical, cultural, and institutional dimensions of Chinese and world civilization, in ways that are continuously being expanded by new archaeological and historical research. The Dunhuang Caves, the complex of Buddhist cave temples in Gansu province, whose sealed library chamber was discovered in 1900, remain one of the most productive sources of Tang period documentation available to researchers. The approximately 40,000 manuscripts, printed documents, paintings, textiles, and other objects recovered from the caves span a period from the 4th to the 11th century, with Tang period materials constituting the largest portion. The ongoing digitization and scholarly analysis of the Dunhuang materials by the International Dunhuang Project, a collaborative effort involving institutions from China, the UK, France, Russia, Japan, and other countries, is continuously producing new insights into Tang period language, literature, religion, and daily life. The specific documents that have proven most valuable include administrative records from the Tang garrison at Dunhuang, tax registers, household censuses, official correspondence that provide operational detail about provincial Tang governance, unavailable from other sources. Medical manuscripts that document Tang period pharmacology and surgical practice have been analyzed by historians of medicine, who find techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that significantly revises the understanding of early medieval Chinese medical capacity. And literary manuscripts, including versions of texts known from later printing that differ from the standard transmitted versions, provide evidence for the history of Chinese textual transmission that changes the understanding of how Tang literature was copied and distributed. The Tang tomb figurines, the Sankai 3-color glazed ceramics that depict foreign merchants, musicians, soldiers, horses, and camels, are among the most extensively collected and studied artifacts of any Chinese dynasty, distributed across hundreds of museum collections worldwide, and continuously generating new research through technical analysis of clay bodies, glaze chemistry, and workshop distribution patterns. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science analyzed the clay composition of Tang Sanchai figurines from multiple sites and identified distinct workshop traditions whose geographic distribution maps the commercial networks through which the figurines were distributed. The potential discovery of Wu Zetian's tomb, the Qianling Mausoleum, on Liangshan Mountain in Shaanxi, which she shares with Emperor Gaozong, and which is the largest of the Tang imperial tombs, has been discussed by Chinese archaeologists for decades, without being acted upon. The Chinese government's current policy is not to excavate imperial tombs unless they are threatened by construction or natural damage, and the Qianling Mausoleum remains sealed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the tomb complex have revealed its internal structure in general terms, but not in the detail that would be available from direct excavation. The 61 stone statues of foreign rulers and ambassadors that line the approach to the tomb, each originally carved with inscriptions identifying the specific polity represented, though the inscriptions are now largely weathered away, are a physical record of the Tang Dynasty's diplomatic connections at its peak that continues to be studied by archaeologists and historians. The legacy of Tang culture in the world's cultural history is both specific and pervasive. Japanese court culture of the Nara and Heian periods was explicitly modeled on Tang Chinese culture. The city plan of Nara was based on Tang Chang'an. Japanese court poetry was modeled on Tang-regulated verse. Japanese Buddhism was shaped by the specific Tang Buddhist traditions that Japanese monks brought back from China. Korean Silla culture absorbed Tang administrative and cultural forms in the 7th and 8th centuries. Vietnamese elite culture maintained a Tang-influenced literary tradition for centuries. The specific forms of Tang influence on its East Asian neighbours, transmitted through the deliberate adoption of Chinese cultural models by polities that acknowledged Tang political leadership while maintaining their own political independence, are one of the most significant examples of cultural diffusion in world history. The Lushan rebellion's demographic catastrophe, whose death toll on the most conservative estimates exceeded every war in human history until the 20th century, remains one of the most consequential events in the history of world population. The census evidence that Chinese administrators collected before and after the rebellion shows a registered population decline of approximately 36 million households between 754 and 764 CE, a decrease that implies actual deaths, flight from enumerated areas, and the collapse of the administrative capacity to count people in war-affected regions in numbers that historians continue to debate, but that no serious scholar argues were small. That catastrophe was the product of a specific institutional failure, the accumulation of regional military power in a single commander's hands without the countervailing institutional checks that might have caught danger before it became irreversible. The Tang court had created the Jijushi system because it was fiscally and militarily necessary given the real defense challenges of a large frontier. It had failed to maintain the institutional checks on the system that would have prevented any single commander from accumulating enough power to threaten the empire. It had trusted a specific person, and Lushan, more than it trusted the institutional safeguards whose maintenance was more important than his specific military effectiveness. The lesson is the same one that appears in every empire in this series. Personal trust is not an institutional substitute. The quality of an individual commander matters less over time than the strength of the institutions that constrain what any commander can do. The Tang Dynasty built the most brilliant city in the history of the world, produced the greatest poetry in the Chinese literary tradition, and opened the Silk Road to its maximum commercial and cultural productivity. And it trusted one man too much, without adequate institutional protection against what would happen if that trust was betrayed. Chang'an's ruins are under Xi'an. The Wild Goose Pagoda still stands, housing the translations that Xuanzang brought from India. The Nestorian stele is in the Forest of Stone Steel's museum. The Tang poems are still read. The Golden Dynasty is gone. What it built and what it lost are both still with us. And the question of how to hold on to one while preventing the other is still, as it has always been, the central problem of every civilization that achieves greatness.